이따가 시작할게요.
네. 발표와 토론을 진행하겠습니다. 저는 동아시아연구소 조경이라고 합니다. 오늘 사회를 보게 되었습니다. 네, 먼저 발표를 시작하시기 전에 간단하게 테사 선생님에 대해서 소개를 드리고자 합니다. 테사 머리스 선생님은 현재 호주 국립대 아시아 태평양 문화역사 언어학부 교수님이시고요. 원래 일본 경제사를 전공을 하셨고 90년대 이후 일본에서는 아주 알려진 지식인들 중에 한 분이십니다. 특히 아이누나 오키나와 그리고 제일조선인 등등 주변부의 시선을 통해서 일본 근현대사의 사실관계도 그렇고 또 이제 90년대 이후 활성화된 기억의 정치에다가 적극적으로 개입을 해오셨고요. 여러 권의 책들을 내셨고 아주 일본을 이제 외부에서 일본을 비평을 하는 진보 지식인들 중에 빠질 수 없는 한 사람입니다. 또 마찬가지로 한국에서도 많은 책들이 이제 번역이 되었는데요. 특히 우리 안의 과거라든가 변경에서 바라본 군대 등등의 대표 저작들이 번역이 되었고 최근 10년 동안은 일본과 한반도의 관계, 특히 제일조선인들의 북한으로 귀국한 제일조선인들, 한국에서는 북송사업이라고 불리는 북조선 귀국사업에 대한 연구를, 조사를 꾸준히 진행을 해오셨습니다. 그래서 그 성과는 북한의 엑소더스라는 아주 유명한 책으로 이제 발표가 되면서 한국에서도 이 문제에 대해서 상당히 관심을 환기시킨 그런 계기가 되었습니다. 오늘은 새로 조사 중이신 그런 한국전쟁과 일본과의 관계에 대해서 발표해 주시는 귀한 자리를 마련하게 되었습니다. 발표는 영어로 진행하실 거고요. 질의응답과 토론에 대해서는 통역을 하면서 진행을 하겠습니다. 한국어 영어 통역에 대해서는 여기 연구소 연구교수이신 이기훈 선생님이 담당을 해주실 거고요. 이제 보충적으로 테사 선생님이 또 일본어를 잘하시기 때문에 일본어 통역이 필요하면 제가 맡도록 하겠습니다. 그러니까 한국어, 영어 기본적으로 질문들은 한국어로 해주시고 또 직접 전달하고 싶으시면 영어나 일본어를 보충적으로 해주셔도 됩니다. 네, 좀 이제 많은 언어들이 섞여서 복잡해질 수 있지만 양해한 협조를 부탁을 드리겠습니다. 그러면 테사 모리스 선생님 박수로 맞이해 주시죠.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a real delight to meet you all, and it's a real delight to see such all. We are old friends. I'm going to talk about some recent research that I have. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. I'm going to talk about some relatively recent research that I've been doing on Japan, particularly Japan and the Korean War. I'm going to introduce this story by looking at a number of personal stories, and I know that some people here also have an interest in issues of smuggling and secret movement between Japan and Korea and other parts of East Asia, so I'm going to talk a bit about that in connection to the Korean War as well. After the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, 16 countries sent combatants to join the United Nations Command, and other countries sent non-military support. And one of the combatants in the Korean War was my home country, Australia. About 17,000 Australians took part in the Korean War at one time or another. Most of those Australians spent quite a lot of their Korean War service in Japan. So in the Australian War Memorial, which is a big museum in Canberra, where I live, there are a number of very interesting things that these Australian soldiers brought back from Korea or from Japan between 1950 and 1953. And one of the things in the museum is this. It's a scarf. It was bought by an Australian soldier in Tokyo in 1953. And if you can see at the top, it says the United Nations. And it shows a map of the Korean War zone, and it has the flags of the countries participating in the Korean War around the edge. But of course, if you look at that map, what do you see in the middle? Mount Fuji. And there is the entrance torii, the entrance to a Japanese Shinto shrine, and there is cherry blossom. And if you look at the flags, you will see that actually there's one flag there which belongs to a country that wasn't involved in the war, that wasn't even a member of the United Nations, and that's Japan. This flag is up at the top. So I don't know who made this scarf, but it seems to me rather interesting. It's like the person who made it knew something that was really rather kept a secret at the time, and that hasn't been very well known since, and that is that Japan actually was quite deeply involved in the Korean War, in, if not exactly military ways, at least semi-military ways. I think both inside Japan and in other countries, Japan's role in the Korean War is generally remembered as being the role of a bystander. This is a picture of the Japanese Coast Guard during the Korean War, apparently observing the conflict from a distance. So Japan is seen as being a bystander, a country that received benefits from the war, but that didn't suffer from the war, and that didn't bear any direct responsibility for the Korean War. One American scholar writes that while all the other nations involved in the Korean War suffered terribly, Japan proved an exception. He says, for it, the Korean War proved an elixir that revitalized its economy, ended the American occupation, and shaped the peace and security treaties that continued to tether Japan to a Pacific alliance with the United States. And then he concludes, Japan emerged from the Korean carnage unscathed and, in a sense, reborn. And I think that's a very common view. It's rather similar to the notorious words of the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, who described the Korean War from Japan's point of view as being a gift from the gods. But I want to argue here that actually Japan was much more involved in the Korean War than those words suggest. And I think that it's important to remember Japan's role in the Korean War, not just because it's an important history, but because, of course, Japan now is so-called reinterpreting the constitution, so that in the near future, Japan is again likely to be involved in military conflicts overseas. And in that context, I think it's really important to understand how Japan was involved in the Korean War and what that meant for the people concerned. And in August 1950, two American congressmen tried to secure the passing of a law which would have allowed the US military to recruit Japanese volunteers to serve in the Korean War. Some Japanese public figures, including famous politicians, also wanted Japanese volunteer soldiers to be sent to fight in the Korean War. Now, those moves didn't succeed, the law didn't pass. The American military command insisted that there were no plans to send Japanese to be involved in the Korean War. And it's quite obvious, I guess, why the US and UN command didn't want Japanese fighting in the Korean War. One reason was the Potsdam Declaration, which was the basis for the Allied occupation of Japan. And of course, Japan was still occupied when the Korean War broke out. The Potsdam Declaration said that Japan was to be disarmed. sort of military or even semi-military involvement by Japan in the Korean War would have seemed like a violation of that Potsdam Declaration. I think that very few people in Korea, whether in North or in South Korea, wanted to see Japanese soldiers back on Korean soil in the 1950s. And in Japan itself, there was a lot of resistance to involvement in the Korean War because Japan had experienced this long war and defeat, and everybody was completely sick of war. There was another reason too why there were problems about Japan being involved in the Korean War. And one important factor was the Sino-Soviet Treaty, which had been signed in February 1950. This treaty said that if either the Soviet Union or China were at war with Japan, the other country would come to support. And actually, a number of American allies, including Australia, were very worried that if Japanese got involved in the Korean War, that might actually make the Soviet Union come into the Korean War on a full scale, and that would maybe create a world war, a nuclear world war. So, there were many reasons for Japan not to be present in the Korean War. But on the other hand, the US forces in Korea were desperate for, particularly for more manpower. And it was obviously, Japan was an obvious source, both of manpower and of all sorts of equipment. So their solution to the dilemma, the American solution to the dilemma, was to use Japan in a range of military support roles, but to try and make sure that the Japanese were as invisible as possible. And one way to do that was to make sure that Japanese participants were officially civilians. And another way was to make sure that they were used in places where they weren't going to come face to face with the enemy. They weren't going to be taken prisoner of war. And the obvious place for that was the sea. So Japan had a lot of seamen, a lot of sailors who were unemployed after the war. A lot of former Navy people were unemployed. And sailors were much less likely to come face to face with the enemy. So the diary of one Japanese war participant, I think, really captures the nature of Japan's role in the war. The entries in the diary are written with very careful handwriting, and they're accompanied by these beautiful sketches of the Korean landscape. But they're all pictures of Korea from the sea, because this, the man who wrote the diary was on a minesweeping vessel, sailing around the waters surrounding Korea. So Japan's direct participation in the war became largely a floating world. It was mostly seaborne, moving quietly and unnoticed through the fringes of the conflict. There are no official figures on the number of Japanese people who fought in the war, but the best estimate is that about 8,000 Japanese were sent to the Korean peninsula to take part in war-related tasks. The great majority were engaged in maritime work. They were sailors. They were on minesweeping ships, transport ships, munition transport ships, and landing vessels. There were a smaller number, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000, who were doing things like repairing military hardware, and they were working on land in Korea. But even these land-based contract workers were generally kept offshore, so at night they slept on ships that were moored in the harbours of places like Incheon and Busan. An urgent US military request for Japanese freighters in September 1950 explained that these were needed because existing policy does not allow the Japanese to go ashore on Korea. Therefore, it's necessary to provide floating housing to accommodate these personnel. A bit later I will mention that there were a small number of Japanese who actually fought on land in Korea. But the US command was very anxious about this. The number of Japanese who were killed or wounded in the Korean War is unknown. There is one official report that records 47 deaths of Japanese sailors and others in war-related tasks in the first 6 months of the Korean War. Obviously, I mean, that's a tiny number compared with the many Koreans and many Chinese and others who died. But I think what's important about this is that these Japanese deaths are not commemorated. They're not remembered except by the families and friends of those who died. The relatives of the dead and the wounded were firmly instructed to keep the circumstances secret, not to talk about these deaths. And those instructions were taken very seriously by the people concerned. Now, since 2012, intensifying debate about collective self-defense, which might see the Japanese military again engaged in conflict overseas, has helped to revive some debate about Japan's Korean War minesweeping missions, particularly. This is a picture of some of the Japanese minesweeping crew with Prime Minister Yoshida sitting at the front. Some supporters of a greater Japanese military role in Asia hail the minesweeping mission as an example of Japan's historical commitment to regional security and as a model for future engagements. And one person writes, Japan's timely provision of minesweeping capabilities was integral for a short-handed US Navy that relied on a handful of wooden auxiliary minesweepers. And then he goes on to say, more than 60 years later, the importance of Japanese support for US operations around the Korean Peninsula remains unchanged. But the people who participated in the operations, the Japanese people who took part in the operations, often see the history in quite a different light, a more complex light. So the first individual I want to talk about is Ariyama Mikao. He grew up in Fukuoka during the Pacific War, and he joined the Navy. And of course, when Japan was defeated, he expected to be demobilized. But towards the end of the Asia-Pacific War, US forces had dropped lots and lots of mines in the sea all around the Japanese coast. So there was a very big task of minesweeping to be carried out. And some members of the former Imperial Navy were kept on in service to carry out those tasks. When it got to 1950, the start of the Korean War, Ariyama again thought that he would be sent home, but that didn't happen either. Ariyama, in October 1950, Ariyama and the ship that he commanded, called the MS-06, were sent to Shimonoseki. And they were told that they were going to be sent to carry out minesweeping in the Tsushima Straits to protect Japanese ships that were taking troops and goods to Korea. But they soon found out that actually they were being sent to a much more dangerous task. So UN forces were planning a landing at Wonsan, and there were mines that had been laid around the port of Wonsan. So the US Navy only had 10 minesweepers in East Asian waters, and therefore, although Japan had officially been disarmed and it wasn't a member of the United Nations, it wasn't supposed to be involved in the Korean War, the US Admiral, Ardley Burr, ordered the head of Japan's Maritime Safety Bureau to send Japanese minesweepers under US command to the Korean War. And Prime Minister Yoshida gave his consent, as long as this was all kept very secret. Many of the minesweeper crew were very opposed to this mission. They thought that they weren't going to be sent back to a war zone. The crew of Ariyama's ship actually got off the ship and refused initially to go on the mission. But then they were encouraged, ordered to go back on board their ship, and they did set off for Wonsan. They arrived in Wonsan and they started doing minesweeping, but very soon one of the US ships struck a mine and sank, and the mission was temporarily suspended. And then on the 17th of October 1950, the Japanese ships started their minesweeping again, and Ariyama's ship was working with another Japanese minesweeper. They worked in always two ships on the side. And while they were working, the other ship hit a mine and blew up. This is not actually that ship, it's another ship being blown in Wonsan. 18 of the Japanese crew were injured and one was killed. And again, there were very strong protests amongst the Japanese crew. Some of them said, we're supposed to be public servants, we're not members of the military force. We didn't volunteer to go and fight in Peru. At one point, there was such a standoff, such a quarrel between the Japanese crew and the American commanders of the minesweeping mission, that the American commander actually threatened to turn his guns and fire at the Japanese ships if they didn't either go back to minesweeping or return to Japan right away. And in the end, the Japanese ships actually turned around and went back to Japan, and the crews were dismissed because of that. But more crews were then sent on minesweeping missions, and those missions continued until the middle of 1952. And about 1,200 Japanese sailors, almost all of them former members of the Japanese Imperial Navy, took part in minesweeping missions during the Korean War, and many of those people then went on to be the key figures in the post-war Japanese maritime defense force. Another person I want to talk about is this man, Sannomiya Kazumi. He was not on minesweepers, he was on a landing vessel. So Sannomiya Kazumi still recalls the horrors of the scene on Wolmido near Incheon, where the Incheon landing took place. So Sannomiya was not involved in minesweeping. He was a crew on one of the Japanese crewed landing vessels which put troops ashore at Incheon for this decisive battle. And you can see some of the landing vessels. According to figures obtained by a Socialist Party parliamentarian around the time of the Incheon landings, 3,922, so just under 4,000 Japanese sailors took part in the Incheon landing. When Sannomiya and his fellow Japanese sailors came ashore on Wolmido, they were immediately confronted by the sight of an abandoned bunker, still containing the blackened body of a North Korean soldier, burned beyond recognition by a flamethrower. Sannomiya had been a sailor in the Asia-Pacific War, and after the war he'd embraced Japan's peace constitution, and he believed that he would never have to go to war again. But he'd gone to work on one of these landing vessels, and the landing vessels at first were used to bring Japanese soldiers and civilians from all parts of Asia back to Japan at the end of the war, and they were also used to bring Koreans in Japan from Japan back to South Korea. But after the outbreak of the Korean War, US forces discovered that they were very short of landing craft, so most of these landing vessels were also placed under US command, and many sailors, including Sannomiya, took part in a variety of landing operations. After the end of the Korean War, Sannomiya Kazumi became a peace campaigner, and he became a member of Fuchu City Council in Japan as well. And in 2003, he tried unsuccessfully to sue the Japanese government because he had been a civilian in a country that had renounced war, but he had been ordered into a combat zone where he said he had been exposed to risk and danger. In all, about 2,000 Japanese soldiers employed with the Civilian Merchant Marine Committee were sent to the war zone under US command in landing ships and transport vessels. But there were also other Japanese sailors who were sent to the Incheon landing and so on, on private vessels, Japanese-owned private vessels. Many of these belong to one particular Japanese company, a company called Tozai Kisei, which sent about 200 relatively small Japanese ships to Korea to take part in various war-related tasks. And there were about 1,300 crew members on those ships. In this case, again, the crews on some of those ships opposed their deployment to Korea. A person called Kitamura Masanori, who was a sailor on one of the ships, recalls that there were intense debates and some of the sailors on the ships actually refused to go on their missions. In the end, about 190 of the Tozai Kisei ships went to Incheon to be involved in various war-related tasks, but some refused. For example, one ship, the whole crew decided they were not going. And in fact, interestingly, they said they weren't going because this mission was in violation of the Japanese constitution. So they weren't going to take part. Many of the Japanese sailors who were sent to the war zone were experienced sailors. Some of them, as I mentioned, a lot of them were former members of the Japanese Navy. But another man called Akeboshi Mutsuro, who worked on Korean war landing vessels, recalled that a mass of labour recruit seamen who were almost completely inexperienced were also recruited. It seems that there were quite a few cases where drifters who gathered in Yokohama, or at that time there were many unemployed people known as krutaro, were semi-forcibly brought on board. In some cases, these people joined the crew only to disappear later. The pay was attractive. They got paid quite a lot of money, more than most workers at that time. And there were also some other opportunities to earn money because US Navy vessels weren't allowed to carry alcohol. So the Japanese sailors could buy whiskey in Japan and take it to places like Incheon and sell it at a huge profit. But on the other hand, the dangers were very real. And for example, in November 1950, 21 families in Japan received the news that all families had feared during the Asia-Pacific War, but that most had ceased to fear in Japan since the war ended, that their sons had been killed in the war zone. So actually 22 Japanese sailors had been killed when their transport ship hit a mine off Wonsan. The sailors were officially civilian labourers, and you know, their presence in the war zone was a source of great embarrassment to the US military. So their deaths were never made public. The only commemoration of their deaths was a secret ceremony, which even the families were not allowed to attend. The families received a photograph of the ceremony and a casket which was supposed to contain the ashes of their loved ones, but was actually empty because the bodies had never been recovered. And they were told never to talk about these sailors' deaths. So thousands of Japanese were sailing from Japan to Korea to take part in the war in one way and another. At the same time, a similar number of young Koreans were sailing from Korea to Japan to be trained in US bases in Japan as part of the Katusa scheme, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So that scheme had just been brought in, allowing the US to recruit Koreans into the US Army. And in August, a Japanese transport vessel brought the first batch of 2,300 Korean Katusa recruits to Yokohama. They were trained at a place called Kanfuji. Many of these young men had just been picked off the streets of places like Busan. One American who recalled those events said, in the contingent ship to Japan, schoolboys still had their school books. One recruit who had left home to obtain medicine for his sick wife still had his medicine with him. Doesn't tell us what happened to the wife. And so these recruits were trained in Japan and then they were sent back to the Incheon landing and so on. Meanwhile, other US bases in Japan, in Saitama Prefecture and Oita Prefecture were being used to train Zainichi Koreans, members of the Korean community in Japan, who had volunteered to fight on the South Korean side of the war. So the pro-South Korean Residents Association, Mindan, had issued a call for volunteers amongst the Korean community to fight in the war. And this is a picture of one of the recruitment centres. And Mindan expected that they would get tens of thousands of volunteers. But actually, the US military was very anxious about this scheme. They didn't really support it. And one reason was because they were afraid that if the pro-South Korean Association, Mindan, recruited volunteers to fight in the war, pro-North Korean groups in Japan would also recruit Koreans to fight on the North Korean side, and would probably get more volunteers. So actually, the US kind of stepped in to try and keep this scheme under control. In the end, 642 people were recruited through, Zainichi Koreans were recruited through this scheme and sent to the war. And a large number were killed, 135 were killed or went missing in action. When the Korean War ended, the occupation of Japan had also ended. And Japan, having regained its sovereignty, had taken away the Japanese nationality of former colonial era migrants to Japan. So they didn't have Japanese nationality, they didn't have residence rights in Japan. And some of the Zainichi Koreans who had volunteered to fight in South Korea were not allowed back into Japan at the end of the war. The disorienting journey of the young Korean Katusa recruits was mirrored by the experience of a smaller number of young Japanese who were transported from US bases in Japan to the Korean battlefront. I've looked at some declassified US documents about this that show that not a very large number, but between 100 and 200 Japanese were taken from US bases in Japan to Korea and more or less to the war front. A lot of these Japanese people had worked in bases in Japan as drivers, or as interpreters, or as what are called houseboys, servants. But many of them, when they were taken to Korea, so when the American troops went to Korea, these people just went along with them. When they were taken to Korea, a lot of them were given weapons, and some of them fought in battles. And at least one was killed, at least one went missing, a small number were taken prisoner of war. Some of the stories that I find particularly disconcerting are the stories of children. So this is one of the Japanese who was taken to the Korean War zone with his American military unit. These were children who were war orphans, and they had been adopted by US military units in Japan as so-called mascots. And 5 of them at least, were taken to the Korean War. One of them was a child called Jimmy, at least the Americans called him Jimmy. His parents had been killed in the bombing of Tokyo. He was taken to Korea at the age of 10 by an American soldier whose name he didn't ever know. After about 1 month, he was abandoned by a soldier who brought him to Korea. And he went to work as a houseboy for an officer in another regiment, the 23rd Infantry. He was moved repeatedly from one unit to another. At some point he was given a gun and taught how to fight. And he claimed that he had killed 3 or 4 Chinese. He also apparently had been slightly wounded in the war. When he was taken back to Japan, he was given $104, and like all the other people in the situation, he was told never to speak about his experiences. But Jimmy had no family in Japan as far as we know, and we don't know what happened to him next. Now, in these cases, the American military became quite anxious about the fact that Japanese were fighting at the front, and they tried as hard as possible to bring these people back to Japan. and that's why there are quite detailed records about them in American archives. But they are also a little known part of the story of Japanese involvement in the war. Now I'm going to tell another personal story. The story of this person, Itagaki Kozo. Unfortunately, I only have this photograph of him. It's not a very good photograph. Like Jimmy, the war orphan, Itagaki Kozo was also an orphan. His father had been a settler in the Japanese colony of Karafto, or southern Sakhalin. And his father had been killed in a mining accident when Itagaki was a child. Itagaki's mother was killed when Soviet troops overran southern Sakhalin, or Karafto, in the final days of the Asia-Pacific War. But Itagaki found himself in a very strange world, a world as transnational but even more murky than the one inhabited by Jimmy. He found himself in the world of Korean undercover operations, smuggling and spying in Japan. And I'm going to talk about his story because I know that some of you have an interest in issues of smuggling in post-war Japan, and also because this story sheds some light on some little-known aspects of the history of smuggling and people smuggling in East Asia. And one important part of this story is that it involves the secret transfer of prisoners of war from the Korean War zone to Japan during the Korean War. So, in 1949, G2, which was the intelligence section of the American occupation authorities, carried out both intelligence gathering and counter-espionage in Japan, established a special operations unit, which was called Z Unit, or sometimes more popularly as the Cannon Unit, in Japanese Cannon Kikan, after its controversial head, Colonel Jack Y. Cannon, you can see here. So Cannon was basically given a brief to conduct secret spying operations. And he established his headquarters in the former Iwasaki Mansion, an imposing Western-style building near Ueno Park in Japan, which had a very large garden and high walls, so you could do things there without people noticing. It's a very interesting place, the Iwasaki Mansion. It's still there, it's open to the public. So if you go to Tokyo, it's very interesting to visit. There are lots of explanations about the history of the building, but there is no mention at all of the fact that it was the headquarters of the Cannon Unit during the occupation. So in the Iwasaki Mansion, the Z Unit collected quite a multicultural group of secret agents. Jack Cannon's closest lieutenant, his second in command, was a Korean man named Yeonchon, who had served with the Japanese military in Manchuria during the Asia-Pacific War, and who later wrote his memoirs. And Yeonchon was appointed to Z Unit, to the Cannon Unit, by President Isoman personally. There were other members of the unit who were Japanese. There were quite a lot of members who were Nisei, Japanese Americans. There was at least one white Russian, anti-communist Russian. And there was a man who was described as a Japanese German. I'm not quite sure what that means. The actions of Z Unit became the focus of fear and rumour in Japan. But I'm not really sure how effective its missions were. Now, let's get back to Itagaki Kozo. How did Itagaki Kozo come to be involved with the Cannon Unit, or Z Unit? Itagaki Kozo's story has long been forgotten by the media and by most scholars. But we know about it because he gave testimony in the Japanese Parliament in August 1953. So, just as some Japanese war orphans survived by going to work for the Japanese and for the American military in the occupation period, becoming houseboys for American and other occupying troops. So Itagaki, who was left behind in Sakhalin when it was invaded by the Russians, became a houseboy to the family of a Soviet officer in Sakhalin. His employer may have been an intelligence officer. In 1949, Itagaki's employer travelled to China, and Itagaki went with him. Apparently, Itagaki asked to go to China because he wanted to try to get back to Japan, and he thought he might be able to that way. Somehow he managed to cross from China into North Korea, and he travelled all the way down to Wonsan, and he got on a smuggling boat from Wonsan to Japan. But when he got to Japan, he didn't have any family there, he didn't have a job, he didn't have anywhere to live. So he got back on a smuggling boat, and he went on working on a smuggling boat for about 2 years. And the smuggling boat that he worked on apparently went between North Korea and Japan, between South Korea and Japan, between Japan and Taiwan, between Japan and the Soviet Union. It travelled all around Northeast Asia. There were a lot of smuggling ships at this time, and Itagaki Kozo didn't get caught until 1951. In 1951, in March, the smuggling boat dropped Itagaki off at a port, secretly, in western Japan. And Itagaki was given a bundle, package, and he was told to take it to Misawa, which is actually quite a long way away on the side of Japan. And he was told he must not open this package, whatever he did. So he got on a train to Misawa, but a little way into the journey, he was so curious about what he was carrying in this package that he started to open it. And the smugglers had obviously sent another man to follow Itagaki to make sure that he delivered the parcel safely. So this other man suddenly appeared, grabbed Itagaki, took the parcel away from him and threw Itagaki off the train. So there was Itagaki in Japan. He had no belongings, he had no money, he wasn't supposed to be in Japan. He was picked up by the police and taken to prison. He was questioned, but very quickly he was handed by the Japanese police to the American counterintelligence services and questioned by them instead. They wanted to know about what he had been doing with this Soviet officer in Sakhalin and what this smuggling ship had been doing. So then Itagaki was brought to trial, and he was given 6 months probation, but immediately handed back to American counterintelligence, and he was put on a train and taken to the headquarters of Z Unit in the Iwasaki mansion. And basically when he got to the Iwasaki mansion, he was imprisoned in the cellars underneath the house, and according to his testimony, he was tortured. He was deprived of food, he was deprived of sleep, he was threatened, and asked lots of questions about what he'd done in Sakhalin, what the smuggling boat had done. Then he was taken to another building in Tokyo, because Z Unit had a number of buildings in different parts of Japan, and he was questioned again. Then he was taken back to the Iwasaki house, and he was told that he was going to be executed. And he was marched out into the garden in the night, and somebody aimed a pistol at him and said, "We are going to shoot you now, unless you tell us more." But it seems as though, at that point, the Z Unit officers realised that Itagaki really didn't know anything more, so they didn't shoot him. Instead, they told him that now he had to become a member of Z Unit and he had to work for Z Unit. And he was put on a ship, so he was put back on a smuggling ship. So he was back to his smuggling activities. So Z Unit had several smuggling ships, which ran missions between Japan and Korea, and probably also between Japan and other places, Taiwan and so on. The ships carried a variety of cargo. Itagaki said that his ship carried boxes labelled cow soap. Cow is a famous Japanese brand of soap, but Itagaki said, I'm a bit doubtful that they actually contain soap. It seems that these Z-Unit ships were used for smuggling to raise money so that Z-Unit could fund its activities, its espionage activities, undercover operations. But the Z-Unit ships also carried people, they smuggled people. Itagaki said that on one occasion his ship carried a Korean man, woman and a small child. They picked these people up in Busan and took them to Japan. Soon after, Itagaki heard that a woman had been taken into the Iwasaki mansion for interrogation, and from the description he concluded that this was the woman that his ship had brought over from Busan. On the next voyage, Itagaki said they transported 5 people from Korea to Japan, including a man who had been taken prisoner of war near Wonsan and who was put on board ship with his hands in handcuffs. Itagaki Kozo went on to be employed by Z-Unit until 1952, and then Z-Unit was disbanded, but some of the former agents continued to work in Japan, and he went on working with them actually until 1953. And then Itagaki fled and went to the Japanese Ministry of Justice and asked them for protection. So he agreed that he would testify in the Japanese Parliament and tell people what he had seen while he was with Z-Unit, but he was afraid that the former Z-Unit agents would kill him if he did that. Unfortunately, the Japanese Ministry of Justice said, really, we can't do anything. If you're concerned, go to the police. So Itagaki gave his testimony in the Japanese Parliament in August 1953, and very soon after he disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to him. But there is at least one other Japanese person who worked for Z-Unit and who lived a lot longer and was able to tell his story. This man, Yamada Zenjiro, who was also very young at the time, but he's still alive. I interviewed him in Tokyo last month and took this photo. Yamada Zenjiro worked for Z-Unit as a cook. He was employed first of all as a cook by Jack Cannon, and then he cooked for the various members of Z-Unit and their prisoners. And he became, what we now call a whistleblower. So he reported on the events that he had witnessed in Z-Unit to the media and to the Japanese authorities. And Yamada's testimony to the parliamentary hearings and so on supports crucial aspects of Itagaki's story. So Yamada actually saw Itagaki when he was imprisoned in one of the Z-Unit houses. But Yamada also has another important story to tell. He remembers how in October 1951 he was taken to another house that belonged to Z-Unit in central Tokyo. He was sworn to secrecy, and he was given the task of looking after about 20 Chinese prisoners of war who were brought to the house. And he also recalls meeting other Chinese, possibly some Korean prisoners of war as well, but we think that they're mostly Chinese prisoners of war. So this is just a picture of, not particularly the Chinese prisoners of war in Tokyo, but some Chinese prisoners of war. These prisoners of war these were Chinese soldiers who had been taken prisoner in the Korean War and sent to Kojedo prisoner of war camp. But they expressed anti-communist feelings, and they were told by the US forces that if you come to work for us, you could come out of Kojedo prisoner of war camp. And the prisoner of war camp was not a very nice place to be, so some 100 or more Chinese prisoners of war took up this offer. But they didn't know what sort of work they were going to do. And by the time they found out what sort of work they were going to do, it was too late for them to change their minds. Some of these prisoners of war were sent to Songakdo near Incheon for training, and the other half of them were sent to Tokyo for training. They were trained by some American officers who spoke Chinese, a South Korean military officer, and at least one nationalist Chinese military officer in Z-unit houses in Tokyo. And they were given parachute training. They were trained to be spies. And from Tokyo they were flown over North Korea or China and dropped into North Korea or China to serve as spies. This was a very, very dangerous thing to do. Most of them didn't survive. A small number of them did survive, and those who did were ultimately sent to Taiwan. And some of those people, a very small number I think are still alive. Some of them have recently written their memoirs, and we know by putting those stories together with Yamada's stories in Tokyo, they fit perfectly, and that kind of confirms the story about these people being trained in Tokyo. And this is an important story because it's never been acknowledged by the US government or by the Japanese government. Obviously, one of the problems, one of the reasons why this mission was kept very, very secret was not just that it was a spy mission, but also that it was a very serious violation of the Geneva Convention on prisoners of war. So Z-Unit was involved in espionage operations in Korea during the Korean War, and it was involved in training these prisoners of war as spies during the Korean War. Recently declassified CIA documents show that there were other espionage missions to North Korea and to northeastern China before and probably during the Korean War. And these declassified CIA documents suggest that there were probably missions carried out by quite senior former Japanese military officers. In particular, a person called Watanabe Wataru. There were a whole lot of smuggling and espionage missions that were being carried out by former members of the Japanese military with the knowledge and support of the US occupation forces in Japan. If you are interested in this, please do go to the CIA website. It is really interesting. So you just type in CIA and then FOIN, which stands for Freedom of Information Act, in Google, and you get this site, and there are lots of documents about espionage operations in Japan during the occupation period, and quite a lot of documents about smuggling operations in Japan during the occupation period. And some of these smuggling and espionage operations also extended into nationalist China, Vietnam and other places, but I won't talk about those. So what I'm trying to present here really is just a story that points out that Japan was much more deeply involved in the Korean War than was generally believed. There were efforts to obscure the presence of Japan in the Korean War zone, but they were never really completely successful. After the end of the Allied occupation of Japan, some Japanese newspapers published a few reports about some of the Japanese who had gone to the war zone. Some of the information about the secret activities of Z-Unit leaked out, particularly just after the end of the occupation. But still, people haven't really very much acknowledged this story in Japan. On the other hand, in places like China and North Korea, there are very exaggerated stories of how much Japan was involved in the Korean War. So this has resulted in a kind of division of memory between places like Japan and I think South Korea on the one hand, and places like North Korea and China on the other. Another reason why this story, I think, is important is because these rather strange combat strategies that were used in the Korean War have reappeared again more recently. So, for example, at the time of the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, many observers highlighted the growing role of what are called privatized military industry, private companies doing military activities in war. But actually, if we go back to the Korean War, we can see that that was happening already with the role of companies like Tosan Kisen. And even interestingly, the US company Vinner, which is now one of the biggest private military contractors, it really got started during the Korean War doing private military contracting in Okinawa. Another practice that you can see emerging in the Korean War that has become more controversial since is what is nowadays called special rendition. In other words, the secret movement of prisoners between one place and another. Again, something that happened after the Iraq War, but that was already happening, as we can see with the story of the Chinese prisoners being taken from Korea to Japan. The complex circumstances of the Korean War made Japan's role in the conflict particularly shadowy and difficult to track. But I think an exploration of this floating world of Japan's Korean War casts new light on the troubled realities of so-called collective self-defense in post-war East Asia. And I think it's really important to create a fuller account of this history, partly to remember the past, but also to think about the future, and to think about, for example, what a greater Japanese military role in the region might mean for everybody involved.
네, 감사합니다. 일본의 한국전쟁 청정원이라는 오랫동안 일본에서는 터부가 되어 있었던 곳이고, 최근에는 조금씩 이런 사실들이 나오기 시작했는데 공공연한 비밀이라고 하는 게 딱 맞는 것 같아요. 다 어느 정도 알고 있으면서도 아무도 문제로 삼지가 않는 그런 사실들에 대해서 아주 구체적인 사례들도 포함시키면서 아주 이렇게 생동감 있게 발표를 해주셨습니다. 작은 얘기들 또 큰 얘기들 여러 가지 질문들이 있으실 텐데요. 잠깐 동안 휴식을 취하면서 그동안 정리를 해주시고 10분 후에 다시 이제 모이도록 하겠습니다. 만나면 이렇게 아까 거기서 그 선생님들과 얘기를 나누면서 사실 이 문제가 일본에서는 그 기뢰를 제거하는 작업을 했던 사람들 특별 소외대라고 했죠. 특별 소외대라고 해서 어느 정도 그 존재에 대해서는 알려진 사실이긴 한데 이것을 어떻게 기억하는가라는 것이 또 다른 다시 문제입니다. 일본에서는 철저히 이게 기억을 오늘 발표에도 있었던 것처럼 잘못된 기억으로 이제 기억이 된 것이고요. 한국에서도 어느 정도 알려져 왔습니다. 선생님이 오늘 여기에서도 인용하신 것처럼 2001년에 MBC에 이제는 말할 수 있다에서도 전적으로 이 문제에 대해서 다루기도 했습니다. 한국의 입장에서 봤을 때 이것이 어떻게 또 기억을 할 수 있는가 상당히 이제 양쪽에서 진보 쪽에서도 또 보수적인 입장에서도 어떻게든 활용을 할 수 있는 역사적 사실입니다. 그러니까 이게 역사적 사실로서도 중요하지만 지금 어떻게 기억이 되는가라는 관점에서 선생님들 다시 생각을 해보시면 아주 재미있는 주제가 아닐까 생각합니다. 자, 작은 얘기로부터 시작해서 편하게 질문을 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 두세 개 정도씩 받으면서 받고 다시 답을 받도록 하겠습니다.
예, 그 발표 잘 들었습니다. 근데 이게 사실은 우리한테 일본이 조금씩 인천 상륙 작전에서부터 개입했다는 거는 사실 조금씩은 알려졌던 일인데, 요즘에 이제 일본에서 이게 비밀리에 진행이 됐다는 게 좀 궁금해졌어요. 사실은 이렇게 일본이 한국 전쟁에 참가했던 게 나중에 샌프란시스코 조약에 유리한 어떤 입지를 제공하는 게 되었고, 또 어떻게 생각해 보면 일본이 여전히 한국을 그 자신의 어떤 일부라고 생각하는 게 아닌가 라고도 생각이 들거든요. 그러면 이거는 일본 안에서 비밀리에 진행하기보다는 좀 드러내놓고 담론화시킬 수 있었을 텐데 왜 그러지 않았는지, 왜 이렇게 오랜 동안 비밀리에 유지될 수밖에 없었는지, 그거에 대한 좀 내적인 이유 그런 게 좀 궁금해서 여쭤봅니다.
이어서 질문하는 것 같은데요. 일단 그 평화헌법과 관련돼서 드러내지 못했을 것 같은 그런 부분은 인정이 되는데, 그 샌프란시스코 강화조약을 보면 한국이 계속 포함될 것 같으면서도 마지막까지 배제되는 그런 구도가 있었잖아요. 그랬을 때 미국하고 한국하고 그리고 일본과의 관계에서 실질적으로 미국의 동아시아의 재편 전략 굉장히 강력하게 작동해서 이런 일이 일어나지 않았을까라는 생각이 드는데, 이제 거기에 대한 부가 설명이랄까요. 그래서 사실은 앞에서도 설명했듯이 어떻게 기억할 것인가에 대한 굉장히 답답함과 양가 감정이 있습니다. 그랬을 때 미국의 동아시아 재편 전략으로 봤을 때 이 일본과 미국의 공모라고 하긴 좀 그렇고요. 그런 공모의 공모인가요? 거기에 대한 의견 설명 부탁드립니다.
또 큰 얘기들이 있기 때문에 두 가지로 일단 끊고 말씀해 주십니다.
영어를 세게 얘기해줘야 들을 수 있을 것 같아요. 왜냐하면 일본 분이나 영어 베이스인 사람도 있잖아요.
근데 한국어 못 써요?
또 있을 수 있으니까 영어
영어로
통역을.
그게 궁금하다. 어차피 얘네가 저쪽 참여하는 마이크로
Regarding San Francisco Treaty, it could be seen as, if there is any chance to see it as the U.S. strategy, U.S. East Asian strategy, part of East Asian strategy, and in a sense, could it be seen as a co-conspiracy between the United States and Japan?
Question. Yes. So yes, why Japan kept the? Can you hear? Okay. Shall I use the microphone?
Yeah. 들리죠?
Why Japan kept this a secret? Obviously, the Japanese government had a lot of information about what was going on, but they may not have had the full information because some of the operations were actually commanded by the United States. So that's part of the story. And obviously, the Japanese government had an agreement with the United States to keep things secret. So in the case of the minesweeping, for example, it's very clear that the Japanese government knew what was happening, but it had an agreement with the US to keep it secret. It may, in fact, have helped Japan to some extent in the San Francisco peace treaty negotiations because the United States knew what was happening, and I think that may have given Japan a more advantageous position. But I guess Japan couldn't really make things public because the United States didn't want them to be public, and the United States didn't want them to be public for some of the reasons that I talked about in the paper, and to do with the questions of the Potsdam Declaration and the reactions that there would have been from Korea and from other parts of Asia and so on. So I hope that kind of answers the question. About the San Francisco Treaty. I think, the San Francisco Treaty is a really important part of history. It's still affecting us so much today, and there's still maybe things we don't know about it. The San Francisco Treaty was advantageous to Japan, and it was obviously very largely shaped by the United States. And it came out of a United States strategy which was clearly to strengthen Japan as a the core ally in East Asia. So for that reason, I think the United States was willing to do a number of things on territorial issues and so on that were very favourable to Japan. So in a sense, there's a sort of collusion between Japan and the United States, but obviously the United States was very much the more powerful partner in that. And there was, the United States was also having to think about the responses of other countries like the United Kingdom and so on to the treaty. So it wasn't just kind of a conspiracy between Japan and the United States.
첫 번째 질문에 대해서 네 가지 이유를 제시를 하셨네요. 일본 정부가 어느 정도 그 사실을 알고 있기는 했지만 이건 기본적으로 미국 정부에 의해서 컨트롤된 거기 때문에 그 전모를 다 알지는 못했을 것이다라는 것이고, 두 번째는 미국과의 그 협의가 있었기 때문에, 그러니까 이것을 비밀에 지켜야 한다는, 그렇기 때문에 뭐 행동이 자유롭지 못했을 것이다라는 얘기고, 그 다음에 샌프란시스코 조약과 관련해서는 미국 그러니까 일본이 여기 참전했다는 것이 어느 정도 일본의 그 이득을 가져다 준 측면이 있을 것이다라는 말씀이고요. 그다음에 네 번째로는 뭐 본문에서 그러니까 이 발표할 때도 말씀을 하신 건데, 이 문제에 대해서는 미국이 단순히 일본이나 그 한국뿐만 아니라 다른 그 주변 국가들과의 관계에도 고려를 해야만 됐기 때문에 비밀에 붙여야 됐다라는 말씀입니다. 두 번째, 샌프란시스코 조약과 관련해서는 이 조약 자체는 기본적으로 일본에게 유리한 것은 뭐 명확하고, 하지만 이제 미국에 의해서 이제 형태가 만들어졌다는 얘기죠. 그리고 이제 그것은 이제 미국 주도의 세계 질서를 재편하는 과정에서 이제 일본을 자신들의 동맹으로 강화하는 그런 전략의 형태를 강하게 띄었고, 그래서 영토 문제 등 모든 면에서 일본에게 유리한 그러한 그 내용들을 담고 있다라는 것인데, 물론 이런 면에서 이제 미국과 일본의 공동이익이라는 측면, 그런 점에서 이제 한 발짝 더 나아가면은 뭐 공모의 가능성도 완전히 배제할 수는 없지만, 그럼에도 불구하고 미국이라는 나라는 기본적으로 그러니까 이 둘이 이제 동등한 파트너가 아니고 그중에서 이제 미국의 힘이 훨씬 더 강한 그런 이 불균등한 파트너십인데다가, 다른 하나는 미국은 단순히 이제 일본만 상대하는 것이 아니라 뭐 세계의 다른 그 강대국들을 또 상대하고 그들의 반응을 살펴야 하는 입장에 있기 때문에 그렇게 단순하게 바라보기는 힘들지 않을까, 그런 말씀입니다.
네, 다른 질문들 어떻습니까?
예, 그 강성현이라고 합니다. 저는 한국전쟁과 냉전 관련해서 연구를 하고 있고요. 선생님 이제 발표를 잘 들었고 여러 가지 점에서 굉장히 재미있는 부분도 있었고 궁금한 점도 들었습니다. 그 사실 한국에서도 2000년 한국전쟁 정전 50주년, 한국전쟁 50주년, 그 이후에 정전 50주년 전후로 해가지고 이와 관련한 연구들이 굉장히 많이 나왔습니다. 사실 90년대 후반부터 해서 나오기 시작해서 2000년 중반까지 박사논문도 나오는데요. 근데 이제 그 내용이 일본 참전뿐만 아니라 비공식적인 참전이죠. 사실은 대만의 참전. 대만도 사실은 참전 안 한 거로 돼 있지만 장개석이 군대 보내준다고 했는데 이제 카팅했다는 게 있잖아요. 근데 사실은 포로 수용소에서는 중국인이 참전했어요. 브레인워싱을, 그러니까 심리전을 위해서. 그리고 소련도 사실 참전한 게 공공연한 사실이죠. 약 8만 명 정도, 조종사 2,000명, 그 이외에 보사고 부대라든지 군사고 문단이라든지. 사실 한국 전쟁을 둘러싸고 굉장히 서로 예민해서 비공식적으로 했던 것들이 이제 다 드러나는 거예요. 사실상 다 참전이었다라고. 그러면 이제 중요한 건 그건데 이 팩트를 어떻게 기억할 것인가의 문제 같아요. 단지 이제 사실이 이랬는데 이게 은폐되어 있었다. 뭐 이런 문제는 아닌 것 같아요. 한국 전쟁 그 50주년 이후에 한국에서 나온 논의들도 사실은 이런 팩트들이 발굴되면서 이걸 어떻게 기억할 것인가의 문제로 이제 첨예하게 쟁점이 되는데요. 일단 한국에서의 기억만 얘기하면 두 개의 기억이 있습니다. 하나는 이제는 말할 수 있다는 식의 기억이죠. 이걸 반성해야 되는 거죠. 일본에게 식민 지배에 책임 있는 어떻게 일본 군인 출신 민간인들이 혹은 준민간인들이 어떻게 넘어와서 이런 작전을 펼칠 수가 있느냐. 유엔도 책임져라. 뭐 이런 이제 일종의 고발 루포식 시각이 있는 거예요. 이른바 진보적 시각이고요. 근데 반대급부로 굉장히 놀라운 게 지금 사실 되게 중요한데 그 당시부터 백선엽 같은 한국 전쟁에서 굉장히 영웅으로 추앙받는 백선엽 같은 사람은 뭐라고 했냐면 공공연하게 얘기하고 다녔어요. 심지어는 일본의 한 저널에도 문예 친출한 저널에 글을 썼는데요. 한국 전쟁에 일본이 참전했다. 그 뭐라고 얘기하냐면 교도통신이 2000년에 전쟁 50주년 하면서 참전했던 그 국가들을 불러서 모았는데 왜 일본은 부르지 않느냐 뭐 이런 식의 기사들을 봤다고 하면서 백선이 뭐라고 그러냐면 일의대수 우리는 이제 옷의 허리대처럼 좁은 아주 가까운 일의대 옷의 허리띠에처럼 가까운 좁은 물수 가까운 사이다. 이건 박정희가 옛날에 쓴 말이거든요. 중국의 보사성어를 들어서 당시 한일협정 때 이걸 들면서 한국전쟁에 참전했다 일본이 그렇게 얘기를 하고 그러면서 우리는 군사협력을 해야 된다. 한미일 삼각동맹 안에서 이제는 미국을 중개로 한 한국과 일본이 아니라 한국과 일본이 직접 동맹하고 직접 협력해야 된다. 그게 이제 바로 2012년 이명박 정부 때 김태호 전략비서관 추진했던 이른바 한일 군사협정이죠. 엄청난 반발이 생겼잖아요.
일단 거기까지 합시다.
이런 두 개의 상반된 기억이 있는데 이거 여전히 여기서 미스 리멤버드라고 했을 때 여전히 모호한 지대가 있다는 거죠. 양날의 칼 같은 성격이 있는데 그거에 대해서 어떻게 생각하세요?
그것은 한국에서의 기억의 방식에 대해서죠.
일본도 사실 그렇죠. 한국도 그렇다라는 거예요. 일본도 무라야마 총리가 얼마 전에 와가지고 그 얘기를 했거든요. 2014년 국회에 와서 했는데 또 반대국부에서는 또 마찬가지죠.
예시부터인 줄 알고 작년이 한국 전쟁 정전 60주년이었고요. 내년이 분단 70주년입니다. 45년이니까 70주년인데 마루아 데츠가 뭐라 했냐면 냉전문화로 해서 일본은 왜 냉전을 자기가 당사자이고 주체인데 왜 그런 냉전의 주체자이고 당사자인 그 제의식이 없는지 그러니까 성찰도 하지 않고 그래서 아마 이번에 오늘이 그렇게 불운한 것 같다고 이렇게 얘기를 한 게 있어요. 근데 이제 아까 지금 그 강 선생님이 얘기한 것처럼 우리가 연구소에서 하는 게 지금 어떻게 보면 냉전의 문화상을 재구성하고 그 냉전의 역사를 다시 이제 그 아시아적으로 재맥락화하는 과정인데 이 아시아가 어쩌다가 냉전이 열전화가 돼가지고 우리가 한국전쟁을 겪게 됐는데 문제는 이제 여기서 그 한국전쟁에 일본이 참전했다라는 것을 우리가 사실을 밝힌다는 것은 미국이 제2차 세계대전 이후에 아시아에서 일본을 소거했다가 다시 일본을 소환하는 없애버렸다가 다시 데리고 오는 이런 것의 역사를 좀 더 명확하게 좀 써내야 되지 않을까라는 생각이 들거든요. 그래서 그 점에서 냉전 아시아의 문화상이라고 하는 것은 이것이 어떻게 사람들에게 각인되고 기억되고 그리고 그것이 지금까지의 그 한국에서 이데올로기 정치가 가능하도록 하는가 요 정도 연결해서 좀 봐야 될 부분이 있을 것 같아요. 그래서 지금 선생님이 쓰신 게 굉장히 재밌는데 이게 이제 우리로서 보면은 이런 어떤 그 아시아에서 굉장히 많은 이동을 하면서 지금 이런 일들이 이제 벌어지고 있었잖아요. 그래서 그것을 위로부터 역사가 아니라 아래로부터의 사람들에 의해서 이것이 냉전의 역사를 다시 재써져야 할 때 이 기억들이 어떻게 그 재면능화될 것인가라고 하는 점이 좀 필요한 것 같고요. 그런 점에서 저희가 지금 하는 이 작업하고 굉장히 연관성이 많은 것 같은데 선생님은 이제 한국 전쟁만 갖고 얘기하시는 것인지 아니면 그 냉전 아시아 전체라고 하는 부분에서 요즘은 어떻게 보시는지.
해보겠습니다. Very long question. The first question is that how to memorize the fact. It's about memory. How to memorize the fact of the world participation of many countries. Well, you said you only talked about Japan participation, but there was also China, Taiwan, and even Soviet Union was fighting in Korean War. And you said you talked about the war memory in Japan, but he was talking about the war memory in Korea, and he said that there are two different kind of memories in Korea. The first one is the bit of from the left-wing position that sees this the Japanese participation in Korean War as and the revelation of suppressed truth. And the second one was from the right-leaning position, and for them that was nothing new, and they were always talking about that from the very long ago. And from that point of view, they've been always talking about that, and also from that context they were raising a need for a military cooperation in Japan. They would keep pushing it. So in that sense, between these two memories, there seems he is suggesting that there are some kind of vague areas, and how do you see these in-between areas? And the second question is, she's basically asking about the Cold War, and you were talking about the Korean War only, exclusively, but is your interest extended to Cold War or just the Korean War? And this memory of the Cold War, how it should be recalled in this contemporary political situation in East Asia.
Thank you. Gosh, very interesting questions. Yes, on the first point, yes, obviously, I should explain, I didn't explain at the beginning really, that this is, what I talked about today is just part of a bigger project, and the bigger project is looking at the meaning of the Korean War for various countries surrounding Korea. We're not really focusing on Korea itself because that's a huge topic that needs its own approach, but we're looking at trying to rethink what the Korean War meant for surrounding Northeast Asian countries, including parts of China, the Far Eastern Soviet Union, Taiwan, and Mongolia. And Mongolia is not very often discussed in relation to the Korean War. Yeah, and yes, so within Korea itself, yes, I'm sort of conscious of the division of memory over the Korean War. It's very interesting to me that you say that Japan's involvement is very well known in the right-wing discourse on the Korean War. And I'd really be interested to read more of that and get a sense of how it's interpreted and which parts of the Japanese involvement that they particularly focus on. Because in Japan, I think it's been almost entirely forgotten, but the minesweeping story is becoming quite researched recently by people more on the political right. And again, I think, as you're suggesting with the political right in Korea, they're taking this up and saying, this is kind of a model for Japanese military cooperation in Asia. So obviously this story can be interpreted in many ways, and I think it's important to, for me, it's important to bring in the personal stories and what that meant for individuals as well as what it meant for kind of the state, because I think that creates a slightly different perspective from the one that you might get from perhaps right-wing historiography in Korea. Yes, and the Cold War. I'm very interested in the Cold War. I'm very interested in how the Cold War is remembered, and I think it's a really important issue. There's a lot of interesting research going on this now. I think we're at a point where we can look back at the Cold War and see it in a different way. So for me, this research project is part of a broader interest in the Cold War. One of the things that I've been trying to do with this project is to think about the beginning of the Cold War, and to think about how the Asia-Pacific War and the Cold War were connected. And I think a lot of the stories that we're finding in relation to the Korean War are really a continuation. So a continuation of the Asia-Pacific War into the Cold War. And in particular, the way that the Asia-Pacific War becomes the Chinese Civil War, and the Chinese Civil War is very much interconnected with the Korean War. And the struggle for independence in Korea then comes into the Korean War. So there are various events from the pre-war and wartime period that flow into the Cold War in important ways. And it's something I'm interested in exploring.
질문하신 거에 대한 답이 될지 모르겠어요.
예, 그게 지금 큰 얘기만 전달돼서 근데 뭐 나중에 얘기를
일단 지금 말씀하신 것만 일단 말씀드리고요. 그러니까 이 프로젝트는 지금 발표하신 내용은 요거 자체로 끝나는 게 아니라 더 큰 프로젝트 일부라는 말씀이시고요. 그러니까 큰 일부란 큰 것은 이것을 둘러싸고 있는 큰 프로젝트라는 것은 이제 한국 전쟁을 한국을 둘러싼 동북아 여러 나라들의 시각에서 바라보는 것이다라는 말씀을 하시고, 방금 강성현 박사님이 질문하신 기억의 분리 한국 내에서 그거는 뭐 알고 계시다라는 말씀입니다. 근데 이제 거기에 대해서 구체적인 말씀은 안 하셨고요. 일본의 경우에 이 스토리는 거의 뭐 전적으로 잊혀진 이야기인데, 근데 최근에 그 우익들을 중심으로 해가지고 지뢰 제거 문제 이런 것들이 조금씩 연구가 되고 있다. 근데 이거는 그 의도 자체가 최근에 일본 정부에서 푸시하고 있는 집단적 사이권 이런 것들 정당화하기 위한 논리로 개발이 되고 있다는 것이고, 이 선생님께서 하시는 그 개인사를 중심으로 한 접근은 이러한 설명에 대한 어떤 대안적인 설명 방식을 한번 시도를 해보신 거다라는 그런 말씀입니다. 그 다음에 냉전과 관련해서도 이거 한국 전쟁도 그 냉전에 관한 이제 좀 더 이제 거시적인 폭넓은 프로젝트의 일부라는 말씀을 하셨고요. 그 다음에 그러니까 이 프로젝트 이제 냉전의 시작을 어떻게 이해할 것인가라는 것과 관련된 건데, 이제 뭐 냉전 그 자체로만 보는 것이 아니라 태평양 전쟁으로부터 이제 계속 이어지는 일련의 과정으로서 뭐 중국 내전이라든가 아니면 뭐 한국 독립운동이라든가 이런 것들과 결부해서 그 하나의 연속적인 흐름으로 바라보는 접근을 취하고 계신다라는 말씀입니다.
그 말이 나온 김에 제가 사소한 오류만 조금만 말씀드리면 편하실 것 같아서, 4페이지에 보면 맨 마지막 단락에
몇 페이지요?
4쪽 US Admiral 아들레이 버크라고 되어 있는데 알레이 버크고요. 예. 그다음에 편하실 것 같아요. 좀 뭐하긴 한데 5페이지 중간에 보면 이제 MS06 0 돼 있고 흥남철수는 1950, 1951이 아니고 1950이고요.
그게 어디라고요? 화남?
5페이지 어디예요?
아니 6페이지요. 6페이지 세 번째 달라. 그다음에 그 10페이지, 10페이지 세컨드라고가
And
10페이지 세컨드 패러그래프. 예. 그 23rd Infantry Regiment of 3rd Infantry Division.
그거는
1, 2,
선생님이
3,
체크를
4, 5,
해주시는 게
6,
좋을 것
7,
같아요.
7
나중에 메일
yeah. 23rd
Infantry Regiment of maybe 3rd Infantry Division. Yeah.
Okay. 23rd Infantry.
그 다음에 11페이지 연정 굉장히 재밌는 인물인데 연구가 좀 있습니다. 굉장히 소력하게 나와 있는데 여기 지금 인상이 이거는 이제 팩트에 대한 문제인데요. 만주에서 활약하고 갑자기 일본에서 등장했는데 그게 아니고 한국에서 국방경비대 입소해가지고 해군으로 입대해서 소련까지 하다가 니콜스 그 미국 G2 장교한테 정보를 이렇게 흘려가지고 그걸로 문제가 돼서 처벌을 받아야 되는데 얘가 한 민간인이랑 일본으로 밀항해서 도망가거든요. 그래서 김동규는 오무라로 가고 경찰한테 잡고 이런 문제들이 굉장히 중요한 내용들이 있는데
일단은 그런 부분은 나중에 직접 말씀해주세요. 너무 구체적인 부분이라서 여기서 토론하기가 좀 그렇죠.
질의응답만 하는.
예.
죄송합니다. 시간도 많이 없기 때문에 질문 김민아 선생님 부탁드립니다. 이제 세 가지.
하나는 좀 그 전쟁에 대한 시각을 어떻게 가져야 되는가 큰 문제고 두 개는 사소한 작은 문제입니다. 첫 번째 아까 발표하시는 중에 그 일본에 있는 민단에서 지원병을 자발적으로 전쟁에 참전하려고 했던 남한군 그런 움직임이 있었는데 그거를 미국이 저지했다. 이유는 남쪽에서 자원병이 생기면 북쪽을 지원하는 자원병이 생길 것이고 그러면 소련과 중국이 거기에 개입하게 될 전쟁이 커지고 자극하게 될까봐 미국이 막았다라는 얘기가 있었어요. 제가 그걸 들으면서 약간 기존에 알고 있던 한국 전쟁의 발발에 대한 지식하고 좀 달라서 질문을 드립니다. 누가 전쟁을 남쪽으로 쳐들어왔냐 올라갔냐가 중요한 게 아니라 전쟁이 일어나게 된 맥락을 보면 미국은 이제 먼저 북침을 하거나 하지 않았지만 전쟁을 하게끔 유도한 것으로 저는 여태까지 한국 전쟁에 관한 책들을 읽었거든요. 늦게 참전했지만 대응하는 시기였지만 그런데 여기에서는 전쟁이 확산될까봐 저지하려는 태도를 취했다라고 발표를 하셨어요. 근데 중국의 입장에서 보면 타이완에서 이미 미국이 타이완을 점령했기 때문에 국토를 점령했기 때문에 타이완을 차지한 것 자체가 이미 전쟁의 명분을 주는 중국 입장에서 보면 것이거든요. 1949년에. 그러니까 이 한국전쟁은 타이완에서 일어나지 않았기 때문에 한국에서 대신 일어났다는 거예요. 제 견해는. 그런 필연적인 길이 있는데 미국은 전쟁을 유도하면서 마치 소비에트 쪽이 개입해서 전쟁이 커질까 봐 우려했다라고 발표를 하셨어요. 그래서 이 두 관점의 차이가 무엇인지 제가 좀 궁금합니다. 두 번째로 카츄샤 얘기가 나왔어요. 그래서 카츄샤가 한국전쟁 그때 만들어졌나 보다 제가 추측을 합니다. 근데 이제 그 팽이나 이런 것들이 굉장히 대우가 좋았고 일본에서도 경제적으로 대우가 좋았다고 얘기를 하셨어요. 그래서 미국에서 이 징병제가 폐지된 것은 1973년으로 알고 있어요. 월남 전쟁, 베트남 전쟁이 끝나고 나서. 근데 이거는 이제 해외의 용병이 되는 제도라고 생각합니다. 카츄샤. 그래서 한국 전쟁 그때부터 이 해외, 아까 이라크 전쟁도 얘기하셨지만 민간인 군사들이 이제 돈 주고 쓰는 그게 한국 전쟁에서부터 시작된 것인지. 네, 이 점이 궁금합니다. 그다음 세 번째로 아주 여기 하우스보이 같이 한국, 일본 몇 명의 남자 굉장히 경험이 있던 사람들을 조사를 하셨는데 그리고 이에 대한 많은 자료가 CIA 인터넷 자료 창고에 가면 많다라고 하셨는데 뭘 기준으로 선별을 하셨는지 그러니까 아까 자료 이기는 지니 그다음에 일본의 누구 있죠. 그래서 이 사료를 어떤 기준을 가지고 뽑아서 이렇게 선별을 하신 것인지 기준이 궁금합니다. 왜 이런 사례를 단지 참전의 팩트만을 기준, 다른 많은 사례가 있을 텐데 혹은 어디에 포커스를 맞춰서 뭘 보여주기 위해서 하시나 선별의 기준 좀 궁금합니다. 네.
좀 많기 때문에 먼저 하고 할까요?
The first question is about the. I'm not sure if it's a historical fact. It's about historical fact because her view on the Korean War and your supposed view on the Korean War seems to be in conflict because you talked about Mindan's effort to recruit voluntaries, but the United States blocked it because they were worried about these other the North Korean supporters to do the same, and eventually the war become bigger. But it seems that she has a different idea of the different knowledge of the Korean War from yours. Because she is as far as she knows, the United States not initially attacked the North, but led North attack of South, and from that at that time it was so basically. The United States indirectly initiated war, not try to prevent war or try to keep peace in the East Asian region. And this is not very familiar story to me, but she is the Chinese specialist. She knows that very well. She thinks that the Korean War broke out because that wasn't able to be broken out in Taiwan.
Right, okay.
Do you understand?
So, in a sense, sort of to protect Taiwan or to...
뭐 어떤 거예요? 대만에서 전쟁이
그러니까
발생해서
타이완을 중국 영토로 생각하고 있죠. 그런데 국민당이 타이완을 점령하고 퇴각하고 이것을 미국이 보호해 주잖아요. 그러니까 이거 자체가 국토의 점령이라고 생각하는 거예요. 이거 내전이 일어날 수 있는 환경이었다는 거예요. 그러니까 이걸 탈환하자는 것 자체가 중국은 너무나 당연한 권리인데 근데 여기서 대륙이 갔다가 졌거든요. 오택동이. 그러니까 언젠가 이 타이완을 통치하고 있는 미국이 전쟁을 하게 되면 언젠가 중국은 붙을 것이다라는 붙어야 되는 상황에 있었다고 제가 이제 알고 있는 거죠. 그러니까 이 전쟁터 말이 어려운가요?
그런데도
미국이 유도했고 전쟁 필연적으로 확산될 수밖에
근데
없는데
그 부분은요 이미 결판이 났어요. 자료에 의해서. 수정주의 논쟁은 많이 꺾였고요. 그다음에 타이완과의 관계수도 전쟁 터지자마자 칠함대 보내긴 했는데 그것도 잘 생각을 해봐야 돼요. 근데 이건 물을 이렇게 들을 수 있는 답이 없을 것 같아요. 근데 오히려 저랑 나중에 얘기하시는 게 더 도움이 될 것 같아요.
미국의 입장에 전쟁의 확산을 정말 두려워했고 막고자 했는가?
네, 그럼요.
근데 필연적으로 이게 개입할 수밖에 없는 구조인데 라는 거죠. 질문.
일단 나중에
Okay. So, sorry, I'm not quite sure that I understand the question. So, with the recruitment of the Zainichi Korean troops through Mindan, I think the US, in trying to restrict that, it wasn't that it was trying to prevent war, but it was just concerned about the possibility of quite a lot of Koreans in Japan being recruited by the North Korean side, which would strengthen the North Korean side, and which I think also the United States was concerned about because they were afraid that it would create further conflict within Japan, within the Korean community in Japan, and therefore within Japanese society. So I don't think it was directly connected with, you know, the role that the US did or didn't play in the initial outbreak of the Korean War. I think it's a different question.
예, 그 민단 자원병에 관한 질문은 그러니까 뭐 전쟁의 확전 이것을 우려했다기보다는 이제 그것이 그 북한을 강화시킬 수 있다라는 걸 우려를 했다는 말씀이고요. 또 다른 한편으로는 일본 내에서의 갈등이 일어나는 것을 우려했다.
제가 그 부분에 대해서 한 말씀 드리면요. 그러니까 일단은 미국 50년 이후는 이제 요시다 시게루 일본 수상하고 미군의 입장에서 미군은 잘 모르지만 요시다 시게루가 항상 얘기를 했던 것은 대부분이 조련계다. 제일동포들의 그 민단 주용병이라는 건 아주 적은 수예요. 사실은. 그래서 이쪽을 건드리면 이 대부분의 조련계의 제일조선인들이 일어날 수도 있다. 이런 그 우려가 항상 있었던 것이죠. 그렇기 때문에 그것을 이제 요시다가 그 메가더한테 계속 얘기를 했었고 그동안 그러니까 그러한 것들이 어느 정도 반영된 것이 아닌가라고.
실제 개인적으로 참전했어요. 조련계에서는.
네네,
개인적으로.
참전했고요.
집단 조직도
항상
안 했는데.
일본에서도 그 조국 방위 운동이라는 것을 계속 했었죠. 그러니까 이 사람들이 실질적으로 지원을 하게 되면 엄청난 큰일이 벌어질 수가 있다라는 그런 생각이 있었던 것 같아요. 네.
And second and third questions are rather simple. The second question is about Katusa, and it said that the compulsory military service in the United States abolished in 1973, and the presence of Katusa means that they had already started recruiting the mercenaries from the overseas in the overseas war and security. And did it start in Korea? The recruiting mercenaries by the United States government. This is the second question. And the third question is, you seem to emphasize the role of houseboy in your presentation. And why was that? Why they are so important in the explanation of the Japanese participation in Korean War?
Right, okay. Yeah, the question about Katusa, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know whether the United States recruited people from other countries directly into the US military at earlier times in history. It's quite possible. There may be other people who know the answer to that one. And about the houseboys, yes. I don't think that the houseboys are particularly important in a military sense in terms of the Korean War, but I think it's a very interesting social history. There were very large numbers of Japanese people who worked as servants for the US military, and their history is not very well known. And I think that the history of the children who were employed on US military bases is particularly interesting and particularly little known. And I assume that there must have been a lot of Korean children who also were living on US military bases in the Korean War period in the same way as these Japanese children were. I don't know if there's been any research on that in Korea, but I think it's an interesting, it's an important story in terms of social history, but not in terms of military history.
예, 저기 하추사 문제는 모르겠다고 말씀하셨고요. 그다음에 학부의 문제는 그 분사적으로는 중요하지 않을지 모르지만 사회사로는 굉장히 흥미로운 주제다라고 말씀을 하시면서 굉장히 많은 수의 그 일본인들이 그 미군 부대에서 뭐 어떠한 방식으로든지 근무를 했고 그중에서 또 아이들까지도 이렇게 거기에 참여를 했다는 것이 굉장히 흥미롭다고 말씀을 하시고 그다음에 한국에서도 그런 것들이 사례들이 있었을 것이다. 그런 뭐 있었죠. 있었다는 말씀인데 예. 그런 말씀입니다.
네, 혹시 하셨습니까?
발표 잘 들었습니다. 이분이 한 전문가가 아니라서 좀 근본적이고 원론적인 질문을 3개만 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째는 주제가 Japanese Participant Korean War인데 한국말로는 그냥 참전이라는 말이 좀 강한 의미가 있어요. 근데 그 participation하고 involvement하고 영어에서 국제적으로 확립된 어떤 대중 조의가 정확하게 있는지라는 질문일 텐데요. 그러니까 그리고 또 뭐 direct involvement, indirect involvement, 그리고 formal, informal이라는 말씀 같은 거고요. 근데 그 전쟁에 관여했다, 참여했다는 조금 다른 뉘앙스가 있는 한국말로 그런 것 같은데 이 연구에서는 어떻게 확립되어 있는지고 이 경우는 일본의 한국 전쟁에 대한 경우는 어떻게 하면 어떤 법준에 맞는 경우인지 첫 번째 질문이겠고요. 뭐 그런 내용은 알겠습니다. 알겠는데 두 번째는 일본이 뭐 조금씩 흘리면서 계속 숨겨왔던 역사가 있다는 걸 뭐 들으면서 알 수 있었는데요. 그 이유가 여러 가지 있겠습니다만 당시 저는 한국 전쟁 기간 동안에 일본의 국제법적 지위의 어떤 제약 때문에 그랬던 것인지 첫 번째 아직 그러니까 뭐 샌프란시스 강화 조약 전이고요. 그러니까 국민국가이긴 하되 미국 점령 하에 있는 것이기 때문에 뭐 그리고 뭐 당연히 무장해제 중이었었고요. 헌법이 있었고 근데 약간 좀 혼란스럽다는 생각이 들었습니다. 그때 일본이라는 범주가 52년 이후와 45년 이전은 확실하죠, 그렇죠? 확실한데 45년부터 52년까지 일본은 무엇을 할 수는 없었는데 뭘 했다는 거라고 설명하신 것 같아요. 제 얘기가 없다면. 근데 어떤 그런 구조적 제약이 포멀하게 있었는가라는 것이 하나 좀 제가 들 생각이고요. 아시는 분이 모르시다는 제가 몰라서. 그리고 뭐또 소비에트나 뭐 중국이나 대만과 달라다는 거죠. 당시 일본의 그런 일리저빌리티는 달랐다는 생각이 들고요. 그렇기 때문에 그걸 계속 은폐해 왔던 것이냐라는 질문입니다. 근데 그건지 아니면 또 다른 복잡한 이유가 더 있었는지 설명하신 것 같은데요. 조금 이게 좀 명확하게는 안 하신 것 같아서 그리고요. 세 번째는 미스리멤버드 워를 찾아봤어요. 사전을. 미스리멤버가 한편으로는 포기하시고 하나의 해석은 두 번째는 이렇게 remember incorrectly라고 하더라고요. 사전 보니까 저는 부자로 봐서 번역을 했는데 단어 영어 네이티브가 아니라서 그 misremember라는 의미가 정확히 들어오지 않고 있기 때문에 이 둘 중에 어떤 것인지 혹시 개념을 잘 몰라서 물어보는데 부자라면 그러면은 좀 correct한 메모리가 가능하다라는 얘기가 되겠죠. 역사학에서 뭐 논쟁이 많을 것 같기도 하고요. 그 지금 misremember라는 말을 쓰신 뭐 의도 혹은 효과가 그런 것인지 많은 경우에 그렇게 된다면은 많은 경우에 이런 형태의 논문들 주로 효과는 폭로인 것 같습니다. 폭로 숨겨져 왔던 것이 있는데 그걸 폭로한다는 의미인데 그런 디스클로저 그런 것이 가지는 정치적인 의미 그리고 보통은 좀 상투적인 걸로 이렇게 좀 잘 몰랐는데 공모가 기가 많았다, 컴플리스트가 많았다는 것이고 이 경우에 이제 미국과 일본의 공모 그런 걸로 해석되는 것 같은데 그렇게 이해하기 맞는지 더 있는데 더 복잡해질 것 같아서 세 가지 하나는 environment participation 일단 개념적인 의미에서 확립되는 게 있는지 알고 두 번째는 뭐였죠? 일본의 지위 당시를 그래서 구조적 제약 세 번째는 그런 미스리멤버라는 그림이 세 가지입니다.
The first question is about the meaning of participation. You use that word, Japanese development. Is there any kind of internationally established meaning of the word? Because in Korean, participation means not just take part in the war, but also fighting. But and then, what kind of meaning are used in Japan? And what is the meaning of the word that you use? The second question is why Japan has hid this history from the public view? And is it because he was focusing on Japan's state, Japan's international legal status at the time, and because Japan was at the time still occupied and disarmed, and so he interpreted your argument like as so basically Japan was unable to do something but did, and that was wrong. Is it correct? And also, if so, was that Japan has a kind of structural restrictions? Restrictions.
Sorry, so Japan was unable to.
Bound to the.
It should
bound by the international law.
Right.
And they could do something if they couldn't do something else.
Yes.
And not like other countries,
yes,
like China or
okay.
Soviet Union. They cannot freely decide what they were doing.
Yes.
And was it kind of there was a structural constraint in Japan's policy and the state activities? And is it because the Japan kept it secret? Is it because of that, or there was something else, other reasons? That's the second question. And the third question is, you used the word misremembered, and he.
I understood that question.
Yes. Fully understood that?
I'm not sure. So was the question, is there actually a correct way of remembering?
No. It's there is a few more than that.
Okay.
He looked up the dictionary, and they come out the two meanings. One is forget. The second is remembering correctly. And if the second is the case, if you use the second meaning, that doesn't mean the correct memory is possible. And then your paper seems to, well, it's not just your paper. The papers like yours seems to have the purpose of the debunking something is hidden. And what is the in your case? What is the meaning? What is the political significance of this debunking?
Okay. Yes. So go back to the beginning again.
Back to the beginning.
Participation and involvement. Yes. Yes, I deliberately used the word participation, and I know. I mean, I guess the distinction in English is a little more vague, maybe. So, what's the Korean for answer?
참전.
So that specifically implies a military engagement. Yes. Participation is a little more vague, but it sort of suggests. I mean, normally if you say somebody participates in a war, you would normally mean military participation. So I think everybody in Japan is aware that Japan was involved in the Korean War in the sense that it was economically involved and provided material. But I kind of deliberately used the word participation to make it clear that it means more than that. And I mean, I think it's interesting that a lot of the roles that Japanese people were playing in the war were roles that would normally be regarded as military roles, so minesweeping and so on. But in this case, they were made a bit sort of vague because they were not officially military people. So,
Not true.
yeah. And then number two is
the reason for the hiding.
Oh, reason
the
for hiding
international
it,
legal status.
Yes. That's a really good question. And there is a whole kind of part of this story which I didn't really talk about. But obviously, Japan is in a very strange position in the Korean War because it's an occupied country for the first sort of 2/3 of the war, and then not an occupied country for the final part of the war. And that makes the role of the Japanese government very difficult to determine, I think, during the Korean War. A lot of the Japanese involvement or participation in the war was decided by the United States. And I don't think anybody really knows how much Japan could have resisted. So if Japan, for example, if Yoshida had said, no, I'm not going to send minesweepers, what would the American reaction have been? I don't think we really know. I think we have to say that the Japanese government, to a fairly large extent willingly, supported the plans that the US had for Japan's role in the war. But obviously it was not an entirely free choice by the Japanese government because of the situation they were in.
So willingly, unwillingly?
So willingly up to a point. I mean, I don't think we can say this was all decided by the Americans. So Japan has no responsibility. The Japanese government has no responsibility.
Relating to second answer, we remember that Japan is occupied only US and is governed indirectly by US. So Japan has some space to act and influence US government and US GHQ. Especially Korean War is so very important to Japan. So I think 표현하기 힘들지만 굉장히 한국전쟁 관련해서 행위 영향이 굉장히 있었다. 그러니까 이제 단독 점령, 간접 통치인 특수한 상태에서 미군에 대한 단독 점령, 간접 통치죠. 그러니까 일본은 일본 내정 문제뿐만 아니라 한국 전쟁과 관련해서는 자기 문제이기 때문에 일본 정부의 영향력이 요시다만이 아니라 일정 정도 그걸 중지하는 사람들도 있었고 특히 이제 미국 국무부 관료들이 나서서 했기 때문에
그러니까 제약으로만 그렇게 하는 게 아니라
my English is so poor to explain about complicated this problem. So.
Well, I think from what you were saying, we probably don't disagree very much about that. I mean, I think Japan's room for manoeuvre was limited, but they did have some room for manoeuvre. And then the last one about misremembering. Yes. Yes. So I mean, I use that word because this term, the forgotten war, is so widely used in the United States and so on. I don't like the term the forgotten war for various reasons. You raise a very good point. I was using misremembered really in the second sense of being wrongly remembered, and that the question, is there a right way of remembering it, is a very good question. Of course, no, I don't think there's a single right way of remembering it. But I think the problem with the way that the Korean War is remembered in the Japanese context is that there has been a very dominant narrative of what that role was, and that narrative has a lot of problems. So what I'm trying to do really with this research is to raise some of the problems and challenge the relatively dominant narrative of the war, and hopefully opens space for a number of different ways of remembering.
첫 번째 질문 그 participation하고 involvement 영어 단어에 대한 관한 문제라고 할 수가 있겠는데 그 말씀이 영어 단어의 participation은 한국말의 참전보다는 훨씬 더 이렇게 베이그하다 의미가 명확하지 않다라는 건데 그럼에도 불구하고 일반적으로 파티시페이션을 사용하게 되면 그 분사적인 참가를 의미한다라는 말씀이고요. 그리고 이제 선생님이 이 단어를 특별히 사용하신 이유는 뭐 일본에서 특히 이제 한국 전쟁과 관련해서 우리는 경제적으로밖에 참여하지 않았다라는 단문이 지배적이어서 그것에 도전하기 위한 하나의 방식으로 이 단어를 사용하셨다는 말씀입니다. 두 번째는 일본의 국제법적 지위에 대해서는 일본은 당시에 이제 굉장히 좀 비정상적인 내지는 좀 뭐라고 표현할까요? 좀 스트레인지한 지위에 있었다고 말씀하셨는데 그러니까 피점령국이었고 따라서 이제 모든 중요한 결정은 미국에 의해서 내려지고 있었고 미국이 뭐라고 결정을 내리는 것에 대해서 일본이 거부할 수 있는 상황이 아니었다라는 건데 뭐 강승현 선생님하고 토론에서 또 나타났지만 그러니까 모든 것을 마음대로 결정할 수 있는 상황은 아니지만 그럼에도 불구하고 어느 정도의 자유권을 갖고 있었다라는 말씀입니다. 그리고 마지막으로 misremember라는 말의 의미는 이제 신현주 선생님 두 가지로 얘기를 하셨는데 forgotten war 이거는 본인이 별로 좋아하는 표현이 아니라고 말씀하셨고요. misremember, wrongly remember 잘못 기억되고 있는 것이라는 그 의미로 사용하셨는데 그렇다면은 뭐 신현주 선생님 말씀하신 것처럼 그러면은 제대로 정확한 기억이라는 걸 존재하느냐? 뭐 그렇게 생각은 하지 않지만 그럼에도 불구하고 이게 이제 잘못된 기억이라고 하는 것이 그 자체가 잘된 기억으로, 정확한 기억으로, 지배적인 기억으로 작용하는 것이 본인이 이제 문제 상황으로 생각을 해서 그것에 도전하기 위한 하나의 이 용법으로 사용을 했다는 말씀입니다.
네, 지금 이 얘기를 들으면서 이제 일본에 대해서 뭐 선생님 계속 일본과 미국과의 관계에서 대해서 말씀을 하셨지만 한국의 입장에서 봤을 때는 또 다른 또 풍경이 보일 수 있다. 한국의 입장에서 봤을 때는 일본이 어느 정도 자유권이 있어 보이고 그러한 또 다른 관점에서 바라볼 수 있지 않는가라는 생각을 다시 한번 해봤습니다. 시간 사실은 외부에서도 많이 오셨고 질문도
외부분들 질문을 받는 게 예의일 것 같아요.
예, 알겠습니다. 예. 그러면 아니 너무 시간이 없어서요. 어떻게 누가 한번 예.
I think my question is very simple. It's the same vein with his last question, but if you think that it's misremembered and if we can live through the correct way to remember, then do you think it would be affected the current problem of the self-defense, collective self-defense that the Japanese government now is trying to change it? Do you think would it affect that kind of movement, and then also in further way the Japan-Korea relationship would get better?
Thank you. That you reminded me that I forgot to answer the most important part of your question, which is what the kind of, in a sense, the ideological purpose of trying to deconstruct the dominant narrative is. Yes, I think there are many different ways of remembering the Korean War and its importance for Japan, but for me, one of the reasons for doing this is to emphasize how close and ongoing the relationship, in good ways and bad ways, between Japan and the Korean Peninsula was in the post-war period. But it's also, I think, to make people look again at what military participation means. So when people talk about collective self-defense and a bigger military role for Japan, they look back to the Asia-Pacific War, but they tend to assume that Japan was not involved in any wars between then and now, or maybe just some UN peacekeeping roles. And I think it's important for that reason to remember the Korean War, and I think it's important to remember what that meant for the people who were involved in the Korean War, which was not very nice for them. And I think in the debate on collective self-defense in Japan, there tends to be too much idealization of what military involvement means. It tends to be viewed in too rosy a light. So that's one of the reasons for my research.
질문을 놓쳤어요. 아까 생각하다가 어떤 질문이셨죠?
지금 일본의 집단적 자위와 관련해서 한일 관계를 개선시키는데 도움이 될 수 있는
네, 거기에 대해서 뭐 선생님이 하시고자 하는 것, 그러니까 좀 정치적인 개입 또는 이데올로기적 개입을 하고자 하시는데, 그러니까 뭐 이 집단적 자위권에 관한 그 이 담론이 일본에서 굉장히 확산이 되고 있고, 그거를 이제 얘기할 때마다 되돌아보는 게 태평양 전쟁이라고 얘기하시고요. 그다음에 일본은 뭐 전쟁에 별로 관여한 바가 없다라는 건데, 근데 이제 그러한 것을 놓고 이 일본 내에서 뭐랄까 좀 군사적 개입에 대해서 굉장히 좀 이상화된 그런 담론들이 확산이 되고 있다. 여기에 좀 비판적인 뭐랄까 인터벤션 하고 싶으시다라는 그런 말씀.
네, 혹시 마지막으로 한 분 웹에서 오신 분들 중에 꼭 질문하고 싶으신 분이 안 계신가요? 없으시면 일본에서도 많이 일본 분들도 많이 계시는데 나중에 편하게 일본어로도 말씀해 주시고요. 오늘 오랫동안 고생하셨습니다. 이제 아마 이 연구가 선생님이 시작 단계이신 것 같아요. 그래서 앞으로 후속 연구들을 더 기대하면서 이만 마치도록 하겠습니다. 5시 반.
공지.
예, 공지 말씀해 주시고요.
일단 마무리하시고.
네. 그러면 이걸로 끝나도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 발표해 주신 테사 모리스 수즈키 선생님과 함께해 주신 이유 선생님께 박수를.
공지가 별게 아니고요. 디프리를 갈 텐데 여기 외부에서 오신 분들 중에 같이 가실 분 손 들어주시겠어요?